Coming up next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Our member host seated at the head table today is Doug Marker. He's a member of the City Club Research Board, and he will ask the first question of our speakers. Following Doug's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members. Please limit your question to 30 seconds or less, and identify yourself as a member when you ask the question. In half a century, we've grown from 2.5 billion to 6 billion people worldwide. In Oregon, from 1.5 million to close to 3. In that same period, some have estimated that a fifth of the species of the world have become extinct or endangered. In Oregon, the loss of our great salmon runs has been the focus of both state and national legislation. Like the proverbial mule, we've been hit over the head with a 2x4 enough maybe now, so we're going to start paying attention. Our speakers today will enlighten us on the salmon listing on endangered species list and its impact on us. Geoff Pampush is the head of Oregon Trout and has been since 1991. His organization has been a leader in native fish and habitat conservation, and in particular, the preservation of salmon runs. Prior to working with Oregon Trout, he was with Fish and Wildlife Service, the Trust for Public Lands, and came to Oregon Trout from the Nature Conservancy. One of his two core beliefs in Oregon Trout is a carrot tastes sweeter when a stick is overhead. Erik Sten is the Commissioner of Public Works for Portland. Up until the recent change in assignments by the mayor, he was in charge, among other things, with sewers. And while that's a joke to a lot of folks, sewers are big with Erik. He was Gretchen Kafore's chief of staff and very active in housing and community development. His approach to environmental issues since his election has been refreshing and broad scale. Erik is a native Portlander and a graduate of Stanford. Duncan Wyse became the president of Oregon Business Council in 1995. The council is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. It uses the knowledge and resources of its members to focus on long-range public policy issues facing Oregon. Prior to the Oregon Business Council, he was the head of the Oregon Progress Board and served before that at the California Public Utilities Commission. He's extensively involved in a wide range of community activities in Portland and in the state. Gentlemen, we're pleased to have you with us. Geoff, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I was struck by the title of the session today, In the Shadow of the ESA. And it is my hope that we see this shadow more as an indication of opportunity rather than something to fear. We were also asked to comment on what the listings of both steelhead and chinook are likely to mean to Portland or the metro region. And before I attempt to do that, I want to make a couple of comments about the context in which I think we're working today. 150 years ago, the Hudson Bay Company overland expedition arrived here and found 100,000 people living at the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers. This was a very rich place then, as it is today. And in the spring, there were an estimated 10 million or more shimmering silver young fish emanating from the headwaters of the Willamette Basin and coming right by this place. That's the picture of yesteryear. Today, the spring chinook numbers about 1,000 pairs, which is roughly at least estimated to be 1% of its historic run, and the steelhead in the Willamette Basin number somewhere around 5,000 to 10,000 fish, which is considered about 10 to 15% of their historic run. And both of these fish have undergone pretty steep declines over the last several years. And the result is what we know it is. Both are on the endangered species list today. Why are salmon and steelhead on the brink of extinction? I think the simple answer is that we arrived. And we did the things that we do. And those things that we do are largely at odds, at least our traditional behaviors, with the long-term survival of salmon and steelhead. But salmons are the victims more of 10,000 small decisions and a few notable big ones, rather than the impacts of any individual sector's particular behaviors or actions on the landscape. To thrive, salmon need the entire watershed, from the bottom all the way to the top, to be functioning. And yet, their needs are pretty simple. They need clean water, they need cool water, they need pools, and they need backwater areas. And if those four conditions are met, salmon will do fine. And obviously those were met historically, but the way we live on land and the way we use water today is seemingly at odds with those basic needs. What do these listings mean to Portland? I guess what I would argue is that I am hopeful that these listings are clarion calls, trumpeting that it's time to finally do something about the problem. You know, we make the statement that we highly value these animals and a healthy watershed, and yet over the next few weeks, our legislature, making a decision in what is probably our most prosperous economic time in the last 50 years, we will invest less than 2% of our general fund in all of our natural resource programs statewide. And on top of that, our legislature will strip away the regulator's budget, who's only trying to do the things that we've asked them to do. Those are the times we're living in. Just as important as the steelhead and chinook listings are what's on the near horizon. The native cutthroat occurs in every stream in the metro area, and the cutthroat decision as to whether or not it will become an endangered species will be made about a year from today. So while there are some of you in the room who think that the problem is an upstream problem, except for Willamette mainstem, let's think a little bit ahead. A year from today, we could have this entire metro region and all the small tributary streams overlain with a cutthroat listing. Additionally, although the headliner to the Oregon salmon plan was the coho, and I think most consider the coho a coastal species, bear in mind that coho historically went all the way up the Willamette and Columbia River, and there's one vestige hanging on here in the Clackamas River. And the National Fisheries Service is likely to make a decision on that animal as well, and it's quite likely that will be an endangered listing within the year. And one more aquatic animal. The western pond turtle totaled somewhere in the hundreds of thousands historically in the Willamette Basin. They're down now to a few dozen or perhaps a few dozen. The Fish and Wildlife Service may list the western pond turtle within 24 months. This crisis is not about just chinook and steelhead. This crisis is about the water. It's about the way we use our water, the way we live around the water, and the way we use the land that drains into the water, which is all of the land. This crisis reflects a vision of Portland from yesteryear, when this was a frontier state and we were trying to push nature out. We cleaned in the name of efficiency. And Portland, the built Portland, largely reflects that vision of yesteryear. But old-timers and the refugees from the overbuilt both, I think, are beginning to embrace a different value. A recent Metro poll indicated that 72% of Metro residents want natural areas within the UGB. 60% of those respondents said we need to apply more regulation to urban streams. There's been a value shift, and the question is whether or not we're willing to do something about these values. Those values, coupled with the fact that what's good for salmon is good for people, should provide the foundation for responding to these ESA listings in Portland. Imagine the value 25 years from now of being able to float in your boat under the bridges of the greatest city in this state and able to fish for and catch a spring chinook. Now, there are 400 miles of the most pristine habitat for both these species in the headwaters of the Willamette Basin behind Corps of Engineers dams. Blue River and Cougar dams on the Mackenzie are probably the principal problems associated with spring chinook spawning and early rearing. Investments in temperature control vices at those two dams could probably do the most in the short term for survival of spring chinook. But the headwater issues may not be the principal problem. Temperature of the main stem, the loss of nearly 80% of the wetlands, backwater areas, oxbows, and meanders, to straightening, riprapping, and diking, may be the most important obstacle to long-term survival of all of our native salmonids, and including the Oregon chub for that matter, in the Willamette Basin. And much of that impact is right here in the metro area. It may be that metro area management of water and bank is the most important factor limiting survival of those two species and others. Can we maintain or restore our native fish heritage? The answer is unequivocally yes. We can do it. These are animals that have withstood incredible odds, volcanic activity, regional fires, catastrophic fires over the last 2 million years. They can hold on if we give them the chance. If we align around a common vision about our future, a vision that's already largely reflected in the Metro 2040 plan, there's the prospect that we can have salmon and steelhead, cutthroat trout, pond turtles, and all the habitats for people that those animals also share with us. While the ESA is arguably the most potent law of the land when it comes to protecting our natural resources, it also has severe limitations, particularly when applied to an entire watershed of a multiplicity of land uses and ownerships. And the regulators, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, are woefully understaffed. They're a very small force, though they cast a relatively large shadow these days. And the reality is that they're resigned to accepting whatever the local jurisdiction can and is willing to bring forward in terms of a recovery plan. The principal roles of these agencies are to occasionally enforce, to bring some federal financing, and to prod their sister agencies. But they are not going to be the ones who are going to develop the recovery plans. NIMS has recently enforced the prohibition against take of endangered species in the Methow Valley, where they have prohibited the diversion of water into the irrigation canals in the Methow to protect the endangered chinook. And that has everyone up in arms. And many of my colleagues would argue that we need to do more of that. And we need to litigate against the agency to do more of that as a core strategy. But I think most would agree that an enforcement action like that, it's polarizing, it's blunt, it's reactive. And if we are going to restore our native fish heritage, the actions we've got to take have got to be affirmative. It's got to be strategic. It's got to be affirmative. Which means that the real job falls with the people in this room and other elected officials throughout the metro region. The agreement PGE, the governor, and the city of Portland, thank you, Erik, struck is a big step to take out Marmot and Little Sandy dams. Those are big actions that result in high leverage. Similar high leverage actions need to be repeated throughout the upper watershed of the Willamette. It's going to require a lot of federal funding and cooperation from the Corps of Engineers. But those actions, with large returns in exchange for large investments, are not going to be enough in the long run. The postcard images of Mount Hood and the Oregon coastline are glorious. But what really matters to each of us individually and as a community is the land, the water, the air that we live in every day that lies in between a mountain peak and the Pacific Ocean. Oscar Wilde once wrote, "We look at nature too much and we live with her too little." The This Portland metro region will double in size in what, 30 years? What will a kid in 2030 live with? If she can't follow the chorus of spring frogs in the pond in her neighborhood, if she can't experience the plunge of the kingfisher to the cutthroat in her neighborhood stream, what will her reaction be to whose responsibility it is to take care of the environment? And will she understand that all things are connected and that we're part of this ecosystem as well? I wonder. To address the challenges we're facing, I have a few specific suggestions. First, I think that Metro needs to be the primary convener, organizer, auditor, and default enforcer of the development of a Metro-wide restoration plan in the context with all the local jurisdictions. There's got to be a single unifying plan within the region. As well, and I think Duncan's going to address this, that effort needs to be closely integrated with the basin-wide effort underway through the Willamette Restoration Initiative. While we focus on tributaries and the main stem in the metro region, I think we've got to be willing to consider expansion of the UGB in the future to create more stream space inside. There is tremendous pressure on the UGB. It is worth our thinking that through. We've got to live close to, and there's a high value paid both by those who live in the developed communities in the Portland metro area and prospectively in the future around being able to be within walking distance of a natural stream. And the $1 billion on CSO in the city of Portland, we can clearly get some of the same benefits, bacteria reduction and heavy metal reduction, by investing in tributaries. And I would argue further that we should rethink how we spend that $1 billion, because that $1 billion is likely to do very little to restore salmon and steelhead to the Willamette main stem. We need to do more research, because frankly, I don't think that we know enough about juvenile life histories, and we've invested so little in research over the last 50 years to take the right specific actions in the Willamette main stem. We don't know if creating more habitat provides cover for more predators, both exotic and native, and thus reduces or increases the mortality of young fish in the main stem. And probably most importantly, we need to retain committed leadership, and we need to elect new leadership. Jose Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher, once wrote, "I am I plus my surroundings. If I do not preserve the latter, I do not preserve myself." In other words, what's good for salmon is good for people. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the City Club for getting us together and thank Jane Cease and her committee for the work they've done. I actually think that's a major piece of what we need to do, which is engage people in these issues. So thank you for getting us here together, and I'm looking forward to seeing the final version of the report. What I thought I would do today in 10 minutes here is try and share with you the approach that the City of Portland is taking to these issues and kind of the problem solving we're doing and how we're going about trying to do our part to restore the salmon. For more specifics, you'll see on your table there's a package from the City of Portland that I think will get you some detail on things that we're doing and certainly some starts on understanding it, and I'd encourage you afterward to take a look at that. But I think the important thing on the Endangered Species Act in my own mind, and it's been about a year since we had the first announcement of the listings in the Portland area, and I think that was March of 1998. And with those listings, we got the distinct honor, in a sense, of being the first urban area in the country to have a listed fish. And the good news and the bad news, depending what your personality is there's no blueprint when you're first. And so we did not have anything to turn to say, here's what we should do. On the other hand, the good news was we didn't have a lot of precedent that we had to follow. And so there's been a lot of concern and a lot of everything from myth to fact and a lot of discussions about these issues, but really in a lot of ways nobody's gone through this situation before. And the tricky part is that the problems that Portland is creating, and certainly Portland is one part of the whole watershed, I think 3% of the Willamette is in Portland, does not come from any one point source and does not come from any one action that we take. It's essentially the sum total of the impacts of running an urban ecosystem, if you will, that is knocking out the rivers and streams in our area. And so in a sense, to actually take this on in the right way, we've got to rethink kind of how we do things in relations to the rivers and streams. And I would make the argument to you, if you look closely at the city and the regions and the state's work here to date, although we have probably the best example of local land use planning and thinking anywhere in the world perhaps, the way we treat rivers and streams is kind of a glaring underbelly of that. And it's something that, in essence, if we can add the thinking on rivers and streams in the same way we've worked with all of our other statewide goals, I think we can get there. But in order to do that, we've got to kind of understand what are all of the things that we do right and wrong, and how can they change. And we also have to commit to a relatively long-term process, because we're not going to turn around 100 years worth of urban development by next year, although we can make dramatic efforts almost immediately, like we've done on the Little Sandy and Marmot dams. And so that's kind of the way we're trying to approach it. So what did the city do? The first thing we did is got together as a council with folks who are interested from all around the city and talked about what should our goal be. And Lloyd mentioned this, as did Jane, but our goal is to do everything we can to restore the fish. It's an important, it may sound small, but it's an important distinction from respond to the law. The law essentially says you can't make things worse. What we would like to do is to try and make things better. It isn't said enough, but it sort of follows to reason. If you're on a path that is about to extinct a species, stopping right then will only slow down the extinction. It will not turn it around, almost by definition. You've got to make things better if you want to change the result. It comes up a lot about public support. One thing is, we found there's tremendous public support on this issue. Whenever the salmon are talked about, I would say it's almost as if people in Portland instinctively, and I think this is true throughout the state, they get this issue, and they want to do things to restore it. There are going to be issues on personal behavior and money. Things cost money, but people are very much behind it, and they almost instinctively sense that despite all of our green work and all of our environmental tendencies, this is the hole that we need to fill in terms of what we've been doing right and wrong. So we started out there. The other question that comes up a lot is, can you afford to be more proactive? Can you afford to spend the money? It will obviously cost more money to try and make things better than it does to stop things from getting worse. I actually, and I'll just say this as I'm getting started on these comments, I don't agree with that paradigm. I actually don't think there's any proof that is a logically true statement. It may be that it's actually much cheaper to be proactive when the dust settles. We'll never know because we're not taking the latter approach, than sitting back and inevitably being sued. When you are sued, you either win or you lose, and given our city actions, we will lose regularly if we were not taking actions on our own, and you live by whatever the court decides, which generally is not the cheapest approach. So we don't believe that by being proactive, that it will cost us necessarily more money. The agreement between the governor, the city of Portland, PGE, and NIMS to take off the Little Sandy and Marmot dams is a perfect example. Under Endangered Species Act, there is no possible way that NIMS could force PGE to take off those dams. But NIMS could force the city of Portland to take a lot of steps on the Bull Run that would be costly, but probably not do that much. I won't take all of my time. It's a short talk to outline this agreement. But by working together, we've actually invested what could be a modest amount of money compared to what would happen in a litigated environment, and come up with two dramatic steps forward, which will free up 22 miles of very, very good habitat. I think if you examine that deal, you will come to the conclusion that it was quicker and cheaper than the approach of sitting back and waiting to see what happens. So we set that goal, and that remains our goal, to try and fix things as best we can. And I always throw in as best we can because we don't really know yet across the board what we can do. The next thing we did, and I think what I'm going to both imply and say explicitly with this talk, is that I think in what Portland's done in the last year, we may not have all of the answers. It'd be far premature to say anything like that. But we have a little bit of a blueprint that I would suggest should work in other cities, should work as we partner with Metro, as Geoff has suggested, and hopefully will work modified a little bit with business and community ventures as well. So we set a goal. The next thing we did is we actually commissioned an assessment of all of the city's practices. We both with staff at the city and with some outside consultants took a look at everything that the city does municipally and tried to figure out which of those things are good for fish and which are bad, and figure out ahead of time what it is we should do. Our goal from that assessment is to put together a short-term and long-term action plan that will essentially put forward to NIMS and the community as this is what we intend to do. I would break the results of that work down into two categories, and we're addressing each category separately. The first is what I would call day-to-day paradigm shifts, or small actions that that harm the river or streams, but that can be fixed relatively easily and with relatively low cost. Our governor often says that the Willamette is dying a death of 1,000 cuts, I think is his line, and what we have found is that quite a few of those cuts are in Portland, and they can be relatively easily remedied. Two quick examples: we've changed, or in the process of changing, the chemicals we use on Waterfront Park. We were not using the best that were available as far as fish issues, and we can change those. We found that we were using a chemical to get roots out of the sewer system, which has to happen so that the sewer system doesn't break. We were using an EPA-approved chemical, which kind of shows you like how sometimes regulations don't go all the way. This EPA-approved chemical was safe to humans but not to fish. We're in the process of trying to figure out how to use something different. That will not cost us a lot more than brain power to figure it. The cost of whatever we do afterward will not be substantially higher. So those actions are happening throughout the city, and we're trying to figure out what we can do to make a tangible difference. The second category are major systems, and these are things that are large and expensive and complex. And although we are taking immediate actions, we were going to talk a lot with the community about what the right approach should be. I'd highlight 4 of those for you. The first is the Bull Run. The Bull Run is a listed stream that 800,000 people drink, and it's blocked, and there's not enough water coming down it in the summer for fish. It's a tremendous problem. We're looking at everything from, in the short term, using about 5% of your summer water in the years to come may come from the Columbia well fields, and that 5% blend would give us enough water in the short term to give the fish what they need during the summer months. In the long run, we'll probably be looking at expanding supply up at Bull Run in the form of some raising one of the dams or building another dam would be the extreme way to go, and so those issues are huge. But by doing the Little Sandy partnership with PGE, we've made a bold step forward immediately while we look at those issues. Second major area that Geoff touched upon quickly is the sewer system. About 100 days a year, we dump raw sewage into the Willamette. By the end of this year, we will no longer dump sewage into the Columbia Slough. We've fixed 100% of that problem. But we're in the process of trying to figure out what the right approach on the Willamette is. And this would take a whole 45-minute presentation, which Commissioner Saltzman would be glad to give you now that he's got it. But we need to figure out what's the right work what's the right combination of work on the Willamette. Combined sewer overflow problem comes from the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act has no relation to the Endangered Species Act. We're just about ready to spend, all of you who pay the sewer bill, $500 million on the Clean Water Act. We have 0 budget set aside for the Endangered Species Act. We ought to meld those two. Other 2 major systems, the transportation system. Roads have a terrible effect, and we've built roads in a way, from a great engineering standpoint, what we try and do on roads is get the water off them as quickly as possible to wherever it goes to keep the roads safe. It's a noble aim, but it also, in certain situations, runs all the stuff from cars directly into streams. We will not fix that overnight, but as we rebuild roads, we can start thinking about better designs. And we're also working right now to get culverts out of streams in places like Johnson Creek, transportation culverts. Final one, which is probably the most tricky, but I think it will be very important, is simply development standards. When we looked at things that the city does, the city issues permits. So under what standards you can develop in this city is decided by the rules and, of course, under state building code. And what I would say is there's no magic bullet there, and there's no obvious answers. We've spent a lot of time working with partners on North Macadam trying to figure out what's the right way to treat the bank, and lots of creative ideas and no obvious answer that says this is the right way to do it. But the city is redeveloping, the city is booming, and we have an opportunity when some of these sites get redeveloped, like a North Macadam or a river district, to rebuild them in a way that's much more fish friendly. And I think we can do that with still enjoying some of the urban densities and everything we've come to expect. I really see redevelopment as the engine that gives us the money along the banks in the Willamette, not on places like Johnson Creek. On places like Johnson Creek, you've got to back away. On the Willamette, you've got to lessen the impact of what's going in. So redevelopment development standards, transportation, the sewer system, and the water system. There are lots of other issues out there, but those are the 4 big ones we're going to concentrate along with the day-to-day actions. Finally, what we're trying to do along with those things is something that certainly you're never told to do by the regulators, is we're really trying to go out and build some community excitement and some community steps to try and figure things out. This cannot be solved unless everybody commits to it. What I'm really looking for, I don't quite have it yet, and we're open to ideas, is sort of the yellow bin of fish recovery. We have 89% of the people in Portland put their recycling out every week, and we need a similar type of commitment to working on the rivers and streams. I haven't quite figured out what it is yet, but we have made some very positive steps. We've teamed up with the Grand Ronde tribes, with Solve, with PGE, and actually with Gresham, Clackamas County, and USA Sewage Treatment out in Washington County to start a program in which we're approaching corporations and asking them to work with us to adopt a stream in their area, and along with it, team up with the middle school or elementary school who will watch the stream and see how their work does. We're going to need a lot of ideas like that. We're also looking at the concept of certifying neighborhoods as fish friendly. It would be a fun thing, but we're coming up with a list of 10 or 15 actions that a neighborhood could take together, and if they did that, maybe we'd go stick little salmons on their neighborhood association signs or something like that. But we're trying to find ways to engage the public, because ultimately it's the public who's paying the sewer bill, and it's the public who really wants the rivers clean. So finally, once all of that happens, and as you look at it, it's really set a goal that's aggressive and that's in line with Portland's values. Every once in a while we'll get a bad rap as Portlanders don't care about these issues, they're urban. That's simply untrue. The response from Portlanders has been dramatic and quick and very good. Secondly, we're looking at our day-to-day actions. Then we're looking at the big systems that we can do something about, like the dams on the rivers up there. And finally, we've got to engage the public. We're now in a place that stuff is all coming along well enough that I feel very comfortable in saying, and it's not that we haven't been there before, but we did not, given sort of the specter that Portland raises throughout the state, we did not want to go out and get very aggressive in pushing on other cities and the state and businesses until we could say with a straight face, we've at least got our act together and we've got an approach that we think is solid and NIMS is with us and we're on the right track. After a year, I'm very proud to report to the City Club, I believe Portland really is on that track. We're on the way. I think this effort will go down hopefully as one of the landmark things of Portland. We're known for Pioneer Squares and waterfront parks, and I think this will be not as simple as one place, but will be at least as significant and will be on the short list of things people talk about that Portland did 10 years from now. I think we're on that approach, and our challenge now is to team with Duncan, to team with Geoff, to team with Metro and the governor, and come up with a way that our work in Portland can simply be a piece in a bigger jigsaw puzzle, but I think that piece is ready to be placed there, and we're very proud of that, and we'll need all of your support to keep that going. I imagine my 10 minutes is up, so we'll wait for questions.
Geoff and Erik are both more articulate and knowledgeable than I am, so I think it's fair that they took their fair share of the 30 minutes we have allocated to this panel. But let me be brief, and I really want to thank the City Club for sponsoring this session. I want to thank Jane Cease and the committee. They've just done excellent work. I have had an opportunity to look at the report, and I hope you continue your efforts on this very important topic. The listings of the salmon and the steelhead do create an enormous challenge and an opportunity for us in the Northwest and in this metropolitan region, and one that we are clearly going to be addressing not just this year, but for decades ahead. It's that big a challenge. And organizations like the City Club can play a truly important role in this effort. This is just such a far-reaching topic that we cannot rely on the expert agencies alone to solve this problem. We're going to have to be in this together and work together to make this happen. As we embark on this journey, I'd like to offer 5 suggestions on how we approach it, and I think it reflects a lot of the conversation we've already heard. And I'll just briefly reflect on each of these points. Point 1, we need to take the time up front to be very clear about our vision, our goals, our measurement systems, and we need to have a system of accountability. It's critical in this area of great complexity. As we focus on our vision in this region, we need to think ecosystem-wide, not in terms of political boundaries. The fish do not know about political boundaries. They're not interested in our political boundaries. They want the ecosystem that will support them, and so we need to think in those terms. 3, as Geoff mentioned, I think we need to be humble about what we know about the fish. There's a lot we do not know, and we're going to have to aggressively investigate and learn about their life patterns and make sure that we're adapting as we go, as we learn more. Fourth, there are steps we can start immediately, as Erik certainly presented very nicely, that we can all be taking. And we also need to develop a matrix of actions and really start to weigh the strategies up and down the river and try to find the highest priority actions. And fifth, I think we need to seize this as an opportunity for community building, an opportunity not only within this region to build community, but up and down the river and throughout the Northwest and Oregon, bridging urban and rural issues. I think there's a huge opportunity here if we do this right. So with those five, let me just touch on each quickly, and we'll open to questions. First, and the heart of this, I think, really does revolve around the vision and our goals and our measurement system. At the Business Council, we started to examine the salmon issue about 4 years ago. And after a lot of searching, we finally found an historian and a biologist who really helped us understand what this issue is all about. His name is Jim Likatowicz. And he explained that the salmon crisis we face in the Northwest is not a result of neglect. It's not really a result of neglect, but really of a faulty vision and a faulty strategy. Jim took us back over 100 years ago to a report that Spencer Baird, the U.S. Fish Commissioner, wrote about in the 1870s. And he described the problems then that would eventually cause the canning industry in the Columbia to evaporate. He said the problems are overharvest, habitat destruction, and dams in the 1880s. These are issues we hear about today. Fatefully, Baird came up with a solution, and it became embodied in our thinking really for the last 100 years. He argued at the time that through artificial propagation, hatcheries, we could replenish our stocks and have a plentiful supply of fish for harvest for the decades and centuries ahead. And at the time, he thought it cost about $10,000. That basic vision and that strategy became the heart of our strategy and vision, as Jim points out, for over 100 years. And the vision focused on the need for fish for commercial and sport harvest. And with the hatchery model in place, it gave us really the excuse for really neglecting the other issues that wild fish really care about, the habitat and the access to the habitat and the clean water. And so we were, with that model in mind, able to develop this region, the economy of the region, the recreation resources of the region, the flood controls of the region, without really spending the time to do those thousands of actions that are necessary to protect the habitat for the wild fish. So the result of this strategy are in. The fish have been declining, and if you take a look at the nature of the fish, where they're coming from, 80% today, roughly, are hatchery fish. And so relatively fewer wild fish spawning naturally in their streams. So we're in the midst of a revolution in terms of our thinking at this point. And we now are saying what we want are wild, naturally spawning fish in the tributaries through the region, and that we need to think very differently about the whole fish and wildlife management system, the ecosystem response. And that's what this is all about. It's changing the vision, changing the fundamental vision of what we're doing here, and readjusting all our systems to be compatible with that new vision. So we felt that was very important because if you try to operate with two visions in mind about what we're trying to do with fish, you're very likely to work at cross purposes. And believe me, there are competing visions. The hydro example is a very good one that Erik mentioned, a landmark decision on the dams, but notice what the reaction has been already. The lake is gone, and people are worried about the lake and the recreation uses. There's a worry about the ability to catch fish now in the river. Again, competing ideas, competing visions, which we've got to grapple with. We can't ignore them. We've got to come together and grapple with these if we're really going to solve this problem. So we need to spend the time to debate what we're trying to get done here. It is not obvious. I promise it is not obvious what we're trying to accomplish. And we need to spend the time up front, agonizing that is, to talk about what we're trying to get done. The Business Council, we came up with a report. I've got it back there. If you can pick it up, you can check out our website and see it. New Vision for Pacific Salmon. A number of people in this room helped us write it. But it is a vision where Pacific Northwest will have sustainable, biodiverse salmon and steelhead runs in watersheds throughout the regions where runs practically can be sustained. That's a broad vision. We came up with principles on how you would achieve it and strategies in relating to the major categories and what we think we need to be doing. We need to apply that kind of a vision with a lot more specificity to this region and to the basins throughout the state. And we need to come up with a measurement system to make sure we're accountable for achieving it. So that, I think, is the most important point. We've got to focus on vision, but let me touch quickly on the other four. Second point is we need to think about ecosystem boundaries, not political boundaries. Point is simple in the context of the metro region. Half the economy is here. If you put half the money into salmon recovery, the fish are not going to get the greatest benefit. You've got to think about up and down the river, the whole system. It is not obvious that the money spent here is going to be the most wisely used as we set priorities. And so we've got to start thinking out of the box in terms of strategies. rebuilding a block of land along the river in the Willamette may be a desirable thing in some level, but it may be much more valuable to restore land upstream that's really critical at some of the land that Geoff mentioned. So we've got to think broadly up and down the river, and we've got to think about priorities. The Willamette Restoration Initiative is intended to provide that kind of a function, to think broadly. Erik sits on, a number of folks up and down the river sit on along with me, and I think we're going to have an opportunity to really try to think ecosystem-wide, and I think that's a really important opportunity. But so again, while it's great that we have a vision for the metro region, we need to do that, we also need to put it in context, as Erik mentioned, into the whole system. 3, we do need to be humble about our knowledge. There is so much we do not know, and we're going to have to explicitly develop a process for learning about the fish as we go, and I think Geoff pointed that already. 4th, we do need to set priorities. We need to find out the short-term actions and get to work on them. Again, I thought Erik did a beautiful job in describing the city's actions there. We are going to, with the Willamette Restoration, we are going to try to systematically identify the major system issues that face the Willamette and try to understand what the priorities need to be as we go forward. It's a huge task. We're going to need a lot of help on that. And the final point, again, back to the original, is this is a great community building opportunity. We've seen it already throughout the state. Governor Kitzhaber has provided extraordinary leadership in developing the Oregon plan for the coast, and it's now extended statewide. Watershed councils throughout this state are working together in ways unheard of in terms of industry and environmental groups coming together to restore salmon runs through plain hard work and voluntary efforts. You can see it already here in this region, the Columbia Slough and the Tualatin and countless other watersheds. We've got to build on that kind of enthusiasm. We need to come together. But in the Business Council's point of view, we've formed a coalition this legislative session with Geoff's organization, the Oregon Forest Industries Council, Nature Conservancy, Defenders of Wildlife, Coalition for Watershed and Salmon Health. One wag said this sounds more like an encounter group than a coalition, but in fact we have come together and I think done a lot of work together in the legislature because we can come together, join behind a common goal of salmon recovery, and I think work together to make this happen. This is a big opportunity within the region and across the state to build community, and let's take advantage of it. Which brings me finally back to the City Club. You are in a great position to help provide leadership in the way you do so well in providing the generalist perspective on a very complex issue and bringing the community together and helping us see a path to restore salmon for now and in the decades ahead. Thank you.
My question will be for Commissioner Sten, and it will return to the theme that Jane Cease first raised and has been repeated several times through today's presentation, and that is, what should the city's goal be? The ESA has been remarked has a very narrow goal, and that is delisting and simply getting a certain population of fish that remove the species from the endangered species list, and I think that would probably be a goal that Portland would be unsatisfied with. So, Commissioner Sten, what has Portland defined as the goal for restoration? And if it has not defined a goal, how should it, and what should be the benchmarks?
Well, I don't know if we have a specific goal under the category of restoration. I mean, our goal is to try and proactively make things better. I think we're focused primarily, and we're trying not to focus on one species of fish. Our sense is that if you look at the kind of impacts that we have, the best thing we can do is focus on the rivers and streams themselves, and the idea being that if those come back in kind of in the way that Geoff said it, to healthy habitats, we believe the fish will come back. I'm not a fish biologist, but I get asked a lot, do you think the fish will come back? And my answer is I think they will. Everything I know and I hear from Geoff and other experts indicates that they will if the habitat is restored. But the other thing I always add to that thought is that if you look at all of the things that we're doing, I'm yet to find anything that we've done to work on, quote, Endangered Species Act that doesn't have multiple benefits for the urban area. I really believe, as I said in the talk, that this becomes one more of the 10 or 15 things that Portland focuses on whenever it tries to write an overall plan. And just quickly, if you look, we built a park, and this was before the Endangered Species Act, out on Johnson Creek, and it's a park that's designed to be flood storage to keep the water off the road on Foster Boulevard. It's beautiful, it's a nice place to go, it's kept a lot of lot of sludge from getting into the river, but it also does other things. And so I think that's part of what we're looking at as well. We do need to come up with some specific benchmarks. And every time the issue comes up at the council, Mayor Katz is all over me about we want some benchmarks to try and figure this out. But in all honesty, I don't think we have them yet. But I think it's something that you're right on the money in asking for.
Eli Lamb, City Club member. One of the things that's not clear to me is if you look statewide, who's really going to be able to make the kind of hard decisions and hard trade-offs between what gets paid for, what doesn't, what's the priority, what's not the priority. So my question to the panel is really who's in charge, and if you can't answer that question, then who should be in charge?
Well, thank you for that question. That's been a huge concern of the Business Council, and we decided, because we were so concerned about that issue, to propose some legislation. We think it's critically important that there be at the state level an entity responsible for creating a vision, creating the measurement system, and doing the strategic planning analysis to understand the trade-offs involved. And we made that recommendation along with these other organizations to the legislature. We have a new organization, the OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which has given some of that function, but as it's come down, and I think the possibility of it taking the long term, taking that role on in the long term. The governor clearly is in charge right now of this and doing a lot of the analysis, and that's great. At the same time, this is a 10, 20, 30-year project, and we've got to find a way to make the kind of analysis and the kind of system, create a system to allow this to happen on a regular basis as we learn more. And so we've put a lot of attention in this session. We're going to continue to do so in the sessions ahead.
Mike Houck, City Club member. I'll try to make this a question and not a statement. Your comments about, Duncan, your comments about needing to prioritize where the money is spent is frequently used in this region by a variety of folks, and I won't point any fingers, but as a justification for not doing a better job at the things both Geoff and Erik pointed out we need to do. I wonder if you could clarify for the audience, the listening audience and City Club members, what you mean by prioritization, because it's frequently interpreted in a manner that is absolutely antithetical to the points Erik and Geoff raised.
Well, we do not have, I just point out, we do not have unlimited resources to spend on any public or private enterprise. And so by definition, we have to make choices. And so as we look at the salmon issue, it seems to me, I think, reasonable that we try to understand both the benefits and the costs of any particular initiative that we're looking at and ask ourselves on any particular initiative, is this the highest priority piece of work to be doing? Erik has asked that, for example, on the combined sewer overflow issue, saying is the best use of $500 million in our region, in this particular project, or is it up the river? And I commend him for thinking about that. Those are the kind of questions we need to be asking. I don't necessarily know the answers, but if we're just going to say any project that we think, at any expense that might possibly be good for fish, we should do, then we've got a template for gridlock and I would point out these are not just economic trade-offs. They're often trade-offs with other values. The flood control, recreation, a series of values. If we're not going to be willing to make those trade-offs, we're going to be in gridlock very fast.
Matteo Luccio, City Club member. As a follow-up to the first two questions, I'm interested in the division of responsibility between the state and the city. To the extent that we know, what resources will the city need from the state? And what are the politics of that, given the perception, however founded or not, that the metro area, the environmental concerns in the metro area tend to impose mandates, unfunded or underfunded mandates on the rest of the state, and now it's the reverse. And so what resources would we need from the state, and how do the politics of that work out?
Well, the politics are terrible, as they are on every issue with Salem and Portland right now. I mean, it's funny and it's terrible. I mean, we have a message from the state legislature that's a complete myth that Portland is trying to put things on rural communities, and I have even broached the subject of maybe we should spend a little less on sewers and a little more on fish. The legislators are all, many of the legislators have been quoted as saying what Portland's trying to back out from its duties. We're not proposing spending a nickel less. So I agree 100% with what Duncan said, that this issue is one of the rare ones that comes along that gives us as a state an opportunity to bridge that seemingly, huge gap between the rural and urban communities. And I don't think that gap exists if you go and talk to a person fishing in a rural community or to a Portlander, but right now it's very deep between the legislature and the urban area. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. I do think the Willamette Restoration Initiative is on the right track. I do think there's a lot of public support, and I ultimately think the citizens are going to be better than the electeds on this issue, and we're going to make progress. But right now, it is troubling. With that in mind, and I should be very clear, Portland is asking the state for $0. We see this as our own responsibility. We, as you know, from the tax base, and this is where we get so frustrated, pay more to state programs than come back to Portland. We think that's right because we have 50% of the economy and not 50% of the area. But we're not asking the state for any specific help. We believe that we'll fund these programs on our own, primarily with water and sewer dollars, but also with general fund. To the extent that the state gets federal dollars, which is beginning to happen, what we would like to do is have any projects that are in Portland and we cannot fund on our own, evaluated objectively as to how much they would help the fish against projects in other parts of the state. And if the ones that we have that we can't fund are higher priorities, then we ought to use the federal funds to do it. But our message to the state is we will get our share done if the rest of the communities pitch in.
Ann Madden, City Club member. This has to do with Erik's question, or Erik's hope, about the yellow bin situation. What could I do right now as a typical urban gardener? What could I do in my yard, if anything, that would help?
Well, a couple of conspicuous things you could do is be a leader in your neighborhood. I think if there is an element that is missing at the local level, it's conspicuous leadership. I mean, not at the city council level, but at the neighborhood level, the local community level. We have 96 watershed councils statewide, a number of them in the Portland metro area. But you, as one who's very concerned about gardening, can be a great example. Use less water, use the right chemicals, zero escape, conserve. All of those activities would directly benefit water quality, which would benefit fish.
And if I could just say, just kind of follow on that very quickly. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion, and I hope it's a great opening for somebody to come up with a business with fish-friendly fertilizers for exactly. Gardeners. I mean, you could make a lot of money in the state if you crack that. And but I think it's clear that some of the fertilizers are really getting into the streams. But the reason that it's right now it's important to conserve water, and it isn't so much don't garden. I mean, absolutely garden, but be thoughtful in how you garden, and water the plants when it's dark and not in the middle of the day. Is the reason that's so important right now is we're short on bull run water in the summer, which the fish need. It isn't, and I just want to take a couple minutes on this. This gets misinterpreted a lot. If you've noticed, it rains here a lot. We're not short on water. We have lots and lots of water, but in the summer months, we only have how much water we can store in the Bull Run reservoirs from the day it stops raining until the day it starts. Now, this year, we have no problem. That's actually true. We have absolutely no problem, but we should still get in the habit of trying to figure out how to conserve, because if we use less in the summer, that water is available for fish, A, and B, it puts off the date at which your rates are going to have to pick up a $200 or $300 million tab to expand storage in the Bull Run. And so a lot of times people don't see the link between it, but it's because in the summer months we're tight and that water comes directly from fish. So the message is to try and use it as efficiently as possible.
Hi, I'm Jim Labby, City Club member. I was on the committee too, and I just want to thank my fellow committee members. It was a great time. We had a great group of folks. I want to just pick up on some things that Geoff referred to in terms of protecting urban streams. It seems to me, I don't want to slip down that slippery slope of subtly attributing blame to anyone the way Jane suggested. It seems like that's a priority, should be a priority in our urban areas, given the insatiability of our urban land market. And As Geoff mentioned, these streams are under tremendous pressure from development. And even if we do expand the urban growth boundary, we need to think about a framework, a program, whether it's through acquisition or through regulation to protect those streams. You look at Kelly Creek, some of our best steelhead habitat in the city, and you know, if we expand the urban growth boundary in there, we got to be thinking about that. And also just considering, and I'm finishing my question up here. If you look I worked in rural Oregon on a lot of these issues, and we have higher standards for stream protection on forest lands than we do in urban areas, in a lot of urban areas, under existing law. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that a priority, and how do we move forward with it?
The question may have been, do we have higher standards for stream protection on forested lands than we do in the urban landscape? And I think the answer to that is yes, we do. It goes back to the vision that we expect, particularly in the unbuilt environment within the metro region. There's not a lot we're going to do to restore 200-foot no-cut buffers in Tanner Creek, as an example. But as we think about the future of the metro region, broader buffer widths are important. There's a lot of benefit, numerous benefits, flood amelioration, things that are good for people, as well as fish and wildlife, that accrue with benefits with buffering urban streams. Cutthroat's going to teach us a lesson too if they are listed in the next year or so. But there's no question that we are retrofitting in many respects, Jim, and more protection in the urban streams is necessary, and I'm hopeful it's a priority of the Metro 2040 plan, and I think it's reflected there.
Well, and just quickly, it's important to give credit when it's due. Metro did a lot of work last year and passed Title III, which was a big step forward in terms of improving the buffers. It's not enough. I think it needs to be tied with more thinking and absolutely with some more work to acquire key areas along the streams. But I think the context of your question is exactly right, and the good news is there have been a few steps forward, and I think Metro's on the right track on this issue, but they really need support from the citizens to push it to the next level. I think Metro's sense may be that the job is done, and it's not.
One more question.
Okay, Mike Abate, City Club member. Relating to Jeff's comment about maybe we need to expand the UGB, I wonder if a mechanism could be developed for improvements to fisheries that relate to off-site indirect impacts. Let me give you the scenario. We're working on the design of a park that has ball fields right next to Johnson Creek. Those ball fields are not going to go away unless there are 500 avid, very involved residents that use those ball fields. There are some environmental impacts because of them that are negative. But those ball fields are not going to go away unless they're replaced somewhere else. So a challenge facing a public agency is, where do we come up with the money to replace certain kind of activities? Doesn't have to be ball fields, could be development along the riverbank. Where can we do that? And could this funding mechanism for federal dollars relate to these secondary projects, not just the ones right along the creek itself?
Well, I wanted to. It's a good point, and I maybe just share a quick point that maybe didn't make explicit enough in the answer about money from the state. I mean, one of the things, if you look at this as a long-term issue, and you look at it as it's the sum total of all of the things that we do in the urban environment that causes our harm, you almost by definition come to the conclusion you cannot solve the problem with scattered grants no matter what the source. What you've got to do is reconfigure your approach so that when the Parks Bureau builds a park, they take that into account, because the parks budget is pretty solid. So when the roads are built, the many millions that are going into the roads is used to put the water somewhere where it's not harmful. And so I think part of the challenge for us at the city is to incorporate that thinking into each of our bureaus' point of view, so that then it doesn't become just an add-on light item, it becomes how you approach the issue. And my sense is as you begin to do that over time, people are very smart who work in these departments, the price will come down because they'll address it as part of the overall plan. If you look at, say, the culvert on Johnson Creek, which got a lot of attention, it wasn't thought about until the end of the project, which meant it cost $1 million to add on the change. Once you re-engineered it, that price was cut in half immediately.
Thanks very much. It's been a very interesting program, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.